In my lifeguarding class, they taught me to be cautious when attempting to save a drowning person. We were told that, in their desperation to find something solid to hold onto, to keep their head above water, the drowning person may grab you and pull you down, drowning you both. Anyways, hello. Welcome to the weird single shower room near the lockers at my local water park. I thought I'd bring you in here so we could share a little intimate moment together. I think a lot about narcissism and other cluster B personality disorders. Looking back, I realize I spent most of my late teens and early 20s as something of a narcissist. I was an insecure, controlling, emotional abuser to most anyone who stumbled into my life. A reflection of the internal abuse I was inflicting on myself, the voices of my abusers rampaging through my head. If you knew me back then, I am very, very sorry. It is a horrible experience I would not wish on anyone. I am so grateful to the people who sacrificed so much to help me get out of that horrible mindset before it became a lifelong condition. Today, I will lay down an understanding of narcissism that reflects my experiences, that I hope can bring clarity to both sufferers and victims. I hope narcissists will see themselves in my description and learn from my recovery, and I hope victims will learn how to protect themselves. Along the way, I will explore what role our social order has had in maintaining the problem. Sometimes you will encounter the sentiment that just because someone has a personality disorder doesn't mean that they will hurt anyone, or that they are inherently a bad person. I understand the impulse to say this, but to qualify as having a personality disorder, it has to have some kind of impact on your life. And even those who seem entirely internal about their symptoms still have the structural psychological problems that shape their logics and actions in the world, which inevitably affect other people. If they are no longer dysfunctional or harmful in the ways that define their condition, they no longer qualify for the diagnosis. To actively be a narcissist is to have the symptoms which are inherently abrasive and dysfunctional to be around, to some extent. Worse than this, their condition often has them blaming others and avoiding addressing their issues. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be provided social and medical support. It just means that it makes sense to acknowledge and take seriously the consequences of their psychology instead of infantilizing them. Sometimes this sentiment is spread by well-meaning people who, having watched a disordered friend struggle against their symptoms, want to encourage people with the disorder to believe in a positive future beyond their worst symptoms. But it's important to recognize that not everyone is like that friend, and such rhetoric of harmlessness, when applied too widely, can serve to lower the guard of potential victims around seriously unmanaged versions of the disorder. When the direct effect of a disorder is to constantly hurt the people around you, it's important we are clear about the stakes. When it comes to supporting narcissists or their victims, I think it's quite obvious we need to be looking out for victims more. I grew up in a family full of untreated personality disorders and their enabling partners. As with many families, most of our children were made indiscriminately by poor teenagers and young adults with unchecked trauma, completely unprepared for parental responsibilities, who grew to resent their kids for ruining their bodies, emptying their pockets, or halting their social life, and spent the next 18 years making it their kids' problem. People who had kids to endlessly love and validate them, punishing them when they expressed any kind of independence or needs. In my family, children were treated as property and investments. Their purpose was to live up to the ideal their parent had for them, and to serve as emotional punching bags for adult feelings. We were either neglected or endlessly sheltered. Kids were expected to be endlessly grateful for being alive, even as we were born into unbridled neglect and contempt. Nobody was coming to save us. We were on our own to figure things out and escape. Our perpetrators used the justification of not being as bad as their parents because they didn't beat us, while still continuing the same cycles of psychological abuse passed down from their parents. The enablers were completely checked out of life, resigned to begging for scraps in toxic unhappy relationships, molding their kids into apologists for their abusive partners, and basically living on autopilot with a kind of learned helplessness. Later, they would use the justification of the norms around them, their so-called intentions, to excuse anything they did. All the decent people were eventually scared off, to be endlessly scapegoated as the villains for not upholding the family dysfunction. I will explore more of the specific abuse that went on in my household a bit later. Rhetoric about how abuse is a choice people make that betrays their poor character, rather than being indicative of their disorder, is to ignore that disorders describe more than a vague tendency. They describe structural brain differences, or deeply embedded psychological difference. It would hardly be worth noting or diagnosing otherwise. People with various mental illnesses display a range of autonomy when it comes to being able to intervene on their worst symptoms, an ability that can grow with time and therapy. I would not say that a narcissist's abuse is necessarily a choice, as a person has to first develop self-awareness and emotional regulation to step outside their normative framing and choose to do different. And even then, they might still be overwhelmed by their symptoms. Some people who give in and express their disorder are not bad people who chose to be bad. They might just not have had the chance to recover yet. Similarly, in order to recover from my experiences in this environment, I first had to become self-aware. I liken it to waking in your matrix pod. No child wants to believe that the ones who are supposed to love and care for them are harming them. It is easier to blame yourself and rationalize what is happening. When you're isolated with dysfunction, it's hard to see it as abnormal. My body accepted the truth before my mind did, reflexively defending itself by filling with a protective kind of incoherent anger and rebellion, presumably to help me stand my ground and dissuade my abusers. Unfortunately, it mostly just escalated the abuse. Shining a light on what was really going on in my family made me the scapegoat, to be blanketed with shame and punishment, to suppress and isolate me. Of course, this only made my incoherent anger worse. I grew to resent everything and everyone. From my limited experience, I concluded that this was an awful world filled with awful people. The escalating abuse eventually drove me away from family and into the arms of people who provided actual support and answers. I started to be validated in perceptions that had been denied all my life. I started to learn that what I was going through was not okay. Through the help of many kind and lovely interventions, people who tolerated my cringe behavior and held my hand through so many realizations, I was confronted with the disordered individual I had become in that environment. I didn't know it then, but my task would be to somehow understand and decode my own mind, while it was a fragmented, dissociative mess that couldn't perceive most of its own dysfunction. Looking back, it was a vague, abstract, seemingly endless process of becoming coherent enough to tackle the next problem. I had to give so much of my early life to recovery. I was driven partially by a sense of needing to be better than my family, and to understand these things so I could overcome them and protect myself from ever getting hurt like that again. I had to educate myself into true self-awareness, to rebuild my sense of self from the ground up, essentially had to craft my own sentience. I had to face up to the harms I had done, and the sinister sympathy of realizing that my family went through similar abuse. I had to go against all my instincts of self-preservation and cognitive dissonance to rigorously and brutally deconstruct who I was, day by day, until I was no longer commanded by unregulated emotions and dysfunctional subconscious drives, all while I had little support, and the abuse around me escalated relative to my growing sense of injustice and independence. So, what is narcissism? It's difficult to get a grasp of it, or hold the concept clearly in your mind, and that's partially because there are many different types. Unlike the Greek myth of Narcissus, such people aren't in love with themselves. Quite to the contrary, all narcissists share a core wound. Their brain defaults to a state of feeling wrong, unworthy, shameful, inferior, empty, never good enough, and at fault for everything. Genetics are a factor, but mostly this comes from child abuse at key developmental stages. This pervading sense of being a bad or unworthy person means that they hate themselves and feel a constant lacking and emotional distress, so they aren't able to feel settled and okay by default. This unconsciously drives them to try to regulate themselves back to some kind of mental baseline using their interactions with other people, turning social encounters into opportunities to prop up their eternally faltering self-image. There are two major behavior sets that can arise from this. A typical grandiose narcissist might brag about their accomplishments and perceived superiority, lie or embellish to seem more impressive than they actually are, tell stories about the many people who apparently crossed them, and how they got their revenge, react with a strange coldness or vitriol to light-hearted teasing or joking, slander others, especially those who go against them, to improve their social status, or get ahead of rumors against them, show contempt for anyone who shows weakness or vulnerability, which is a reflection of how they regard themselves, do and say things that they think signal how cool, smart, strong, or invincible they are, almost like they are trying to convince themselves, or as if they are trying to cover up the reality of their condition. Turn low-stakes things into competitions to vie for social status. A vulnerable narcissist might have permanent puppy dog eyes, or act wounded or scared all the time, express negative feelings and thoughts about themselves, but seem unfazed by any reassurance, emphasize real or imagined victimhood to receive affirmation, tell lots of stories about how life did them dirty, how no one appreciates them, and everyone is against them, tell stories about how people were mean to them, or abandoned them for no reason, that are low on detail or make no sense, lie, or act avoidant about inconvenient aspects of themselves, or their life. Both types might have main character syndrome, act entitled to people's attention and time, seek validation from others, railroad conversations into being about them, get agitated or wander off when the conversation isn't about regulating them, complain and criticize everything with no regard for how they're impacting the space, portray humanity in a cynical light, reflecting their own projected qualities, exclude people from the space who see through their act and refuse to appease them. Narcissists also tend to have a reduced sense of empathy. In neurotypical interactions, communication is padded by various inbuilt social intuitions and instincts about what other people's feelings and intentions are. Neurotypicals read and perform various subtle social cues and emotional expressions that not only say more than raw language does, but also create a feeling of conversational flow and obligation, making us want to return the energy and favor of others, to regulate and comfort each other through mutual feelings and reciprocal exchange. Surely that qualifies for the most autistic thing I have ever said. This is how most of us avoid wanting to bash each other's heads in with a rock. Empathy isn't an uncomplicated good, however, as there is also a kind of conformist element to it, in that we might feel deep anxiety and discomfort going against perceived social conventions, and feel a strong urge to adjust ourselves to others, even if we're doing nothing wrong. Empathy-challenged individuals, like narcissists, struggle in various ways to read these subtle social signals, understand and interpret them, or perform them back to others. The parts of their brain tasked with empathy are deficient or different, often because they weren't modeled empathy at key developmental stages. This can mean they are less able to intuit other people's feelings, less likely to be affected by others' pain, and less likely to show social reciprocity in communication. Overall, they do not regard social convention, or care about how they affect people, or about comforting others in social interactions. This leaves them more centered on their interests and needs, and less withheld from antisocial or selfish behavior. Empathy troubles can lead to compensatory development of other skills, such as mirroring, manipulation and lying, to help the narcissist survive in a world where access to most resources are earned through social reciprocity. In narcissists, the little empathy they have might be deployed to understand the people they intend to manipulate to their ends more effectively. A grandiose narcissist might show aggressive or confrontational behavior at inappropriate moments, project their own lack of empathy onto others, expecting others to operate as dispassionately as they do, or be worthy of contempt, reduce matters of emotional intelligence and social tact to strength versus weakness, or logic versus emotions. A vulnerable narcissist might demand a superhuman level of empathy and care from others, even as they are actively abusing them. Both types might be oddly envious of others, misunderstand their failures to connect with others, blaming everyone else, act entirely self-centered, only regarding their experiences and pain as important, be undeterred from acts that might negatively impact others, rationalize their behavior and how it affects others, because they cannot feel the pain of others, and so it isn't real to them. Because narcissists always feel inadequate and constantly alienate and fail to connect with others, their life is a constant suffering, regardless of how they try to hide it. To live in constant pain like this can lead to extreme emotional dysregulation, causing outbursts of strange behavior and sentiments, especially when triggered over their core wound. Narcissists become worse the more emotionally dysregulated they are, as there is less energy for masking their worst traits around others. A grandiose narcissist might poorly mask their underlying anger or cruelty with a facade of emotional disaffectedness or pseudo-rationality, demean those around them as inadequate, stupid, or weak, portray the emotions or needs of others as crazy or unreasonable, project their own issues onto everyone else, blame others for the pain they cause. A vulnerable narcissist might have an emotional outburst, then dissociate, forgetting details about what happened, start crying and playing victim when they were in the wrong, to shut down inconvenient conversations, or sway bystanders to their side, withhold communication in a passive-aggressive way until everyone orients around appeasing them, threaten suicide or self-harm, perceive the world in extremes of all good or all bad, quickly shifting attitudes from praise to condemnation about everything and everyone, including themselves. Have you feeling as if you're walking on eggshells, worried that any minor thing will set them off? Use addictive substances and experiences to escape. Engage in spontaneous or risky sex. Having endured neglect and abuse during key developmental periods in their childhood, narcissists may act in ways that seem stunted, immature, or childlike. This can be related to poor behavior modeling by parents, but sometimes it goes deeper. When a child endures extreme abuse during a time when a fundamental part of their brain is developing, that development can be stunted, leaving various areas of the brain shriveled up and hardly functioning. This basically cements certain deficiencies into the structure of their mind, which can be very difficult to overcome later in life. It's easy to take a healthy brain for granted, and the various unconscious processing it does to bring stability to our lives. For a narcissist, areas of the brain concerning emotional memory may be deficient, leading to a specialized amnesia concerning past emotions. They might not be able to maintain a wholesome view of all the emotions they've ever felt for someone, reducing them to perception by the emotion of the moment. A narcissist can struggle with whole object relations, an intuitive understanding of the world as made up of complex beings with qualities we like and dislike. Instead, they perceive others as either all good or all bad. The ability to form an integrated, realistic, relatively stable image of oneself and other people, particularly as they change over time. For the grandiose, they alternate between seeing others as either useful to them or scum, and for the vulnerable, as either their savior or their persecutor. There is often no nuance in the choice between loving or hating themselves. They tend to chaotically switch between both. This can make even mild criticism impossible to parse, as it would mean they are all bad, which cannot be integrated. There's a great article on the site, issendai.com, called Missing Reasons, which explores the tendency for abusers to have selective amnesia about their victims' grievances and reason for estrangement. It shows how abusers struggle to retain any meaningful information about distressing topics. That whole blog about estranged parents forums is great. One thing that is odd about the narcissist is that they hate themselves and think they are awful, yet they would never accept that notion from anyone but themselves. The psychology of the narcissist is oriented around concealing their core wound from themselves and others, and to this end, they perform a false fantasy self that either isn't troubled or is on top of the world. The reality under this facade is that, because of their extreme emotions and psychology, they constantly act in ways that alienate anyone who tries to get close to them and ruin their lives. So they understandably fear that if people truly knew them, they would hate them the way that they hate themselves, and would leave them, just as their parents left them emotionally. They would do anything to avoid being re-traumatized. This fear of abandonment is inherent to their condition, but gets worse as the list of people they've alienated grows larger. This, coupled with an intense need for external validation, can lead to extreme attempts to keep people in their lives, ranging from emotional manipulation, self-harming, suicide threats, stalking, and violence. On the other hand, having experienced a narcissistic environment where they weren't allowed to be their own person, where loving their caregivers brought them only pain, they distrust and fear love, and fear losing themselves in others. This can mean that the closer they get with someone, the more they feel in danger of being swallowed up by that person, and the more they push them away, self-sabotaging and ghosting. This can be very confusing and hurtful to the loved one, who is suddenly being treated with coldness and contempt for being loving. These two forces combine to create the push-pull relationship cycle, the "I hate you, don't leave me" phenomenon.
I'm afraid that if I get too close to you, I'll have to give up too much of me.
I can't be myself when I'm around you.
Because narcissists are stunted in key ways, they might manipulate others into feeling obligated to care for them, in a process known as parentification. The victim will be manipulated and made to feel responsible for managing or supporting the narcissist's life. This labor will be taken for granted, and can enable them to never grow and learn to handle themselves. A narcissist parent might even parentify their kid. They might speak too candidly about their adult life and troubles with the child, with no sense of boundaries. They can make the child feel responsible for managing their well-being, and responsible for their abusive reactions. They might expect them to handle too many chores, or constantly babysit a sibling. This leaves the child with no room to handle their own needs. It should go without saying that our society should be providing more support to parents who cannot care for their child for whatever reason. Narcissists tend to be invalidating as a baseline mode. Nothing you do can elicit any kind of positive or affirming feedback. When you go against them, you'll be demeaned or punished. The message this sends to their victims is that they are never good enough and must either fall in line or face their abuser's wrath. This can be particularly damaging to children who look to their caregiver in vain for love and comfort. They do this because that's how they were treated growing up, and because they feel awful inside all the time, and nothing seems to make it better. Infantilization is a type of invalidation where the narcissist might constantly demean the abilities of their victim, violate boundaries to manage the victim's life for them, exert control over finances and decisions, take over any challenging tasks, so the victim can never learn to do these things themselves, shame and suppress curiosities about mature subjects, overstate the dangers of the world. This fosters an ignorant, innocent, fearful, dependent psychology in their victim. This is most often done to children, but sometimes to adults as well. As a neurodivergent person, I suffered this especially. Sometimes a parent is just immature and fails to teach their children things. Infantilization is different. Infantilization is about creating terror and dependency to keep the victim around as supply for as long as possible. This can also be a self-confirming prophecy, as the parent leaves them helpless, then chastises them as helpless. Narcissists are a diverse bunch. You might even say there's a spectrum of narcissism. Some express their dysfunction externally, basically never introspecting, and others direct their dysfunction inwards, tearing themselves apart and causing other emotional problems. Some engulf their child's entire identity. Others ignore and discourage their child. Some may self-regulate through grandiose performances and social climbing. Others lack the ability to pull that off, and cope on a smaller scale by being more manipulative and vulnerable with a select few people. Some have overt contempt for weakness or victimhood. Others find a crowd that will validate them for their victimhood. Some might be hard to identify as narcissists due to their involvement with various charitable endeavors, but they would always center themselves in these endeavors and participate more for their own image than to genuinely help. Some mask their symptoms really well, appearing charming or self-efficacious to others who don't know them personally. Others give off weird vibes even to the most clueless person. There's also overlap with other disorders. Narcissists with autism might struggle even more with empathy. Those with ADHD might struggle more with emotional regulation or memory. The fact that neurodivergent people are more likely to be neglected or abused by parents sets them up to be more likely to develop these personality disorders too. If my description of narcissism has felt way too close to home, and you're worried you could be one, I suggest listening to the whole video first. The truth is though, if you were a serious narcissist, you probably wouldn't have made it this far. You wouldn't be able to handle the dissonance of hearing your inner world described so plainly. It is possible you have some of the tendencies, however. Most people do, and it's never too late to recover. Because of the random and free dissemination of info on the internet, any disordered person is at risk of encountering a space where people speak incoherently or plainly about their disorder, so you cannot quite prevent them from developing a feeling of persecution and isolation. It is the prerogative of narcissists, when only partially recovered, to play the victim of others' condemnation, but this erases the entire history of what they've put their family and friends through. I guess I am avoidant of this tendency. For me, my first impulse was always to turn away from truly reckoning with the harms I had done, to try to focus on the often rightful condemnation of my peers, as persecution. It hurts for anyone to be condemned, but especially for someone who needs constant validation. In my recovery, I realized that I needed to overcome that, to accept that despite my own victimization, I had victimized others. To me, a narcissist who has truly reckoned with who they are is not threatened by discussions of their disorder at its worst. They can say, "They're right, I was like that. I'm glad someone is speaking plainly about this." A world in which people understand these things helps hold me accountable. I want to speak
Now about the specific abuse I went through. Hey, I'm little Val. Nice to meet you. Everything had to be done exactly to father's expectations. If something wasn't up to his code, he would be sure to let you know, through passive-aggressive silent treatments, demeaning remarks, intimidation, and emotional abuse, later escalating to minor physical abuse. "Just wait until your father comes home," was the threat mother would use, while otherwise managing our lives so we wouldn't set him off. She would later remark that he was so good when they first got together, implying it must be my fault he is abusive now. At times the role would switch, with my father poorly defending me against my mother's outbursts, which occasionally escalated to emotional and minor physical abuse too. Every time I wanted attention, I was made to feel bad for asking. Most of the time, they would be glued to the television, completely tuned out. What did these people ignore their child for? Soap operas. Overall, nobody really listened to me, or cared about me, unless it served to benefit them. I spent most of my youth locked away playing with action figures or video games, the only joy I had in my life at the time, and I still couldn't get anyone to show interest in those little worlds I was exploring. I was utterly alone. Tens of thousands of dollars poured out of our household budget every year, to pay for my parents' addictions to gambling, scratch cards, lottery, coffee and cigarettes. There was always a mysterious scarcity of funds for other even practical things. My parents spent away a large inheritance, intended for my education and future, on a lavish middle-class lifestyle, that barely lasted my first 10 years of life, later plunging us into crippling credit card debt that uprooted our lives, and took me away from my only friends and community, further isolating me with them. My parents made little effort to understand my ADHD. They barely objected when doctors threw me on pseudometh to smooth things over at school. I had no way of understanding what those drugs were doing to my developing mind. I was constantly given advice that didn't work for my brain, and was constantly demeaned and punished for my completely expected difficulties. My ADHD became primarily a justification and excuse, for how I was just such an awful child who must have deserved their outbursts. Through all this, somehow nobody noticed I also have autism. My parents forced maleness on me all throughout my youth, never showing any concern for what I wanted, remarking poorly on every feminine expression I made, and ignoring every sign of my discontent. The only time I was ever able to socialize with girls was when they didn't have a say in it. Later, scarred by years of denial and unwanted puberty, I had to push through brutal depression to fight for years to be taken seriously and gotten any help. My confused early attempts at transition clearly disgusted and embarrassed everyone in my family, and soon most of them dissociated. My own father would walk behind me in public out of embarrassment. I lived with the damage of that time,
and the damage of that unwanted puberty every day. This is something that is not emphasized enough when speaking about this disorder. A narcissist's child is treated as an extension of themselves, their norms, ideals, or dreams, so any way in which the child is different is often smothered out of existence through subtle shaming, denial, manipulations, and outright abuse. This leaves a child broken and totally gaslit about their identity and reality. There is more I could comment on, but this video would go on forever. I focus on these examples because they reflect the unresolved trauma and narcissistic traits that ran rampant in my family. As I reckoned with the reality of my experience, I grew more empathetic and forgiving. I imagined that all my family needed was the kindness others had shown me. I made the mistake of thinking that, with my new perspective, I could fix my family, make them acknowledge the harms they did, make them love me and see me. If I could just push through this necessary trial of denials and defenses, on the other side would be someone like me, and the reconciliation I always wanted. But reconciliation requires genuine effort from both ends. No one can make it happen alone. I spent a long time bashing my head against that wall, instead of just finding people who would actually love and support me. I did this because I had been infantilized and conditioned into thinking I was helpless and needed them. And because I thought that maybe they just had some kind of misunderstanding. What I needed to realize, and maybe you're stuck here too, is that humans don't do such things for long without a serious baked-in pathology of selfishness or cruelty. It's really hard for any of us to accept the notion that our parents' neglect or abuse came from a place of genuine cruelty or maliciousness, rather than ignorance. Of course, if confronted they would deny it. They would insist that they loved and cared for us. Why would they confess? It doesn't serve them to do so. And most people tend towards a self-rationalization of their past actions by default. You have to stop looking for your experiences to be validated by your abuser. It's important to know that such people have a different psychological baseline than us. They don't feel typical empathetic care and connection, and so what they are describing as love and care is something completely different. They cannot see their own cruelty or maliciousness, because that is the background noise of their life. Moments where they acted out their worst tendencies came from an emotional headspace and conflicted with who they want to be, so it is not stored in their stunted memory. What they remember best is the emotion of the moment, which to them justifies whatever it is they did. They weren't just ignorant, and they didn't make a mistake. With the perpetrator, some part of them at the time enjoyed their suffering subjugated child. With the enabler, they utterly failed in their priorities, shaming their children into appeasing the abuser like them. If you're stuck begging an abuser for scraps, just get out and build your own life. It's not worth it. These abusers function by manipulating others into feeling bad and obligated to them. You don't owe anyone anything. You have the right and the power within you to hate and leave someone who failed you, to live your life on your own terms, to feel okay, for once. When you no longer rely on them, have found your own sense of self, build your own life, have supportive friends, inner peace, then you can think about changing them. But regardless, don't give your whole vulnerable self to those who've proven they are willing to hurt you. Much of a narcissist's actions can be understood as attempting to hide their core wound from themselves or others. For them, to be seen as the scared, uncertain, weak, ailing creature that they are, is like salt being poured into the wound. They would do anything to prevent people from knowing their true vulnerable selves. For grandiose narcissists, they do not want to be seen as weak. They despise the pity and sympathy anyone offers them, because they want to be seen as not suffering their wound. As not suffering any wound. It's an active attempt to convince themselves and others that they're strong and don't need anyone else, because they never got the support they needed when they were younger, and it's easier to pretend that is fine, than to accept that they were deeply wounded by this. This is how the grandiose narcissist's mask of invulnerability, superiority, and disaffectedness works. Their answer to the difficulty of accepting that they were abused is to make up an infallible fantasy self to protect them from the harsh realization of their life. Anything that contradicts the false idealized self must be discarded from mind. Instead of getting actual psychological help, which risks acknowledging their wounded core, they try again and again to fix their core wound by mirroring the contempt they were shown by their parents and society for having emotions and needs. And it fails every time. This inevitably leaks out into how they treat others. Often you'll find they are averse to recognizing anyone's pain or victimization, never mind their own, because to acknowledge the legitimacy in such things is to start thinking too deeply about their own pain and their own behavior. Narcissistic parents tend to make children for their own benefit, to be little versions of themselves, to live their failed dreams for them, or as status symbols. Children of narcissists don't get to be full people outside their parents' preferences. The child must always act to make the parents happy, or else be chastised or punished. In this, they do not allow their child to individuate, to become a person with their own essence and desires. When a child is not allowed to gain a sense of individuality separate to a parent, they form a sense of self dependent on the distorted feedback of the abusive other. The abuser's voice becomes their inner voice. This lack of individuation is often the origin of a narcissist's unstable or non-existent sense of self and identity. Because of this, they often struggle to meaningfully differentiate themselves and their preferences from the world or other people in their lives. They often imagine and project their own emotions and intentions onto others. To them, the world and everyone in it must match up to the disordered version of the world in their head, must serve to validate them, or else they are wrong, and can rightly be chastised and punished until they change to match the narcissist's preferences. People who validate and appease a narcissist are known as supply. Narcissists tend not to treat their supply as people, more so as audiences for their life, unwitting caregivers, receptacles for their stressful feelings, or as compliant dolls to control and play with. They are treated as a resource to be tapped for regulating output, and abused when failing to perform that given role. Or abused regardless, as is often the case. If a tiger is well fed, there's no need for it to pounce. Those who act as supply long-term are known as codependent or caretakers. Narcissists usually don't have healthy functional relationships, so there is either no relationship or a dysfunctional and enabling one. Codependents stay for many reasons. They might feel trapped due to economic circumstances or expectations. They might suffer a low self-worth and learned helplessness from early abuse, made worse by the narcissist's constant emotional battering. They may have been parentified, manipulated into feeling responsible for this person's well-being. Some might stay in such relationships because, on some subconscious level, the narcissist's coldness, invalidation, or abuse, and the dynamic of begging to be seen or loved, feels oddly comfortable, in that it resembles familiar dynamics from the abusive environment they were raised in. When you've been modeled a toxic conditional form of love from your caregivers, you can easily fall into the trap of performing the unresolved dynamics with friends or partners, believing that familiar abuse is the best you can get. They may stay for years, begging to be seen and heard, fighting to be shown basic respect and love. A process that can seem bewildering to outsiders, who wonder why they cannot see the obvious solution: to simply leave and seek love elsewhere. If you are in such a situation, you need to make peace with the reality that you were born into a disordered family, that it wasn't your fault, and no one can make someone else see them, love them, or stay with them. You can only control yourself and seek a different environment. You need to heal, to learn to love and respect yourself so that you no longer desire this familiar abuse. You must recognize your own psychological tendencies that make you stay, and consciously plan against them. If you defy your instincts, you can and will find people who will love you without having to beg. You have to rewire your brain to want that instead. I want to talk about what it's like to have a relationship with a narcissist. Because both types of narcissists lack the means to establish a mutual loving relationship with others that isn't oriented around their self-regulation, they often perform a special ritual in its place. The ritual varies by type, and just overall depending on the person, so I will try to cover it in general terms. Deep down, a grandiose narcissist still craves real connection, and even for this they feel contempt for themselves, for still needing other people, even though they had to give up such needs in their neglectful home. The vulnerability and intimacy involved is also near impossible for them, as no one can be allowed to get close enough to see their wounded core. How can a disordered person convince others to regulate them through the pain and confusion of their abuse? Maybe their family, a boss, coworker, or roommate, and the victim feels a sense of obligation. Some have a psychology of trying to earn the affection of a disordered person, or fix them with love. Others have no sense of obligation to the narcissist, so work is needed to trick them into becoming invested. The grandiose narcissist will initially see people as completely unimportant until they appear desirable or useful to them. Once someone has been identified as potential supply, they will be put through a process known as idealization. None of us are ever really interacting with the people in our lives directly, more so with the representations of them in our mind. For the narcissist, this is particularly troublesome, as their inner representations are extreme and self-serving. Idealization means that they have moved you from the all-bad category to the all-good category, a pedestal nobody could remain on for long. This can be seen as similar to how a child idealizes the parent. This motivates them to love bomb you, which might just mean treating you as a rare equal, or temporarily masking their disordered self behind an artificial performance of respect or love. They might see a partner as a flawless savior, showering them with compliments or gifts. There can also be an element of mirroring, where the narcissist draws upon your personality and interests to perform a facade of familiarity. A narcissist gets those with low self-esteem to identify here, since these are the only people desperate enough to tolerate their later behavior. To such a person, this might be the first or only time they've ever felt seen or respected, which keeps them invested, even as the relationship turns cold. Children, often dependent on the narcissist caregiver, will be idealized to the extent that they perform obedience to the values and commands of the narcissist, otherwise enduring a devastating regime of criticism, neglect, and punishment. This can lead the abused child to struggle with an independent sense of self, as their whole identity has been shaped in service of pleasing and managing the emotions of their abuser. This abuse is often rationalized as discipline. Often, the narcissist will glorify the most early years of life, when the child was fully dependent and pliable, and hadn't grown enough to express a rebellious independence. Children are often isolated and powerless with narcissistic caregivers, in that they lack the experience to identify what's happening to them, or the power to set boundaries. The idealization stage for a vulnerable narcissist may be somewhat different. Often noticeably wounded, and less charismatic or mature, they must rely more on subtle emotional manipulation to secure supply, and they tend to seek validation from a smaller group of people. They signal their woundedness or perpetual dissatisfaction to everyone, until they snag someone who is either highly empathetic and caring, a self-denying masochist, or who self-regulates by serving others. Then they hit them with a combination of love bombing and mirroring, with a focus on transforming them into a pseudo-parent and personal cheerleader. This so-called favorite person will become an enabling caregiver, an emotional punching bag, and a source of endless affirmation to prop up their ever-faltering self-image. The problem with being a favorite person is that no human alive can fill the hole in their soul, and the FP will eventually be resented for not fixing them, and feared for getting close enough to see their true fractured self too clearly. A vulnerable narcissist suffers especially from a lack of stable self or identity, for which their mind compensates by drawing a sense of self from other people, especially their favorite person. There can be a kind of reflexive mirroring of the interests, attitudes, beliefs, and behavior of others. This is done as a survival mechanism to try to find a sense of self through others, or to gain the favor of a new potential supply. Others might feel they are being deeply understood, when in reality, they are just looking into a mirror, which might say a lot about them, as a reflection of self is perfect supply for a narcissist. This can be especially dangerous, as vulnerable narcissists can end up dependent and enmeshed with a strong abusive personality, such as a grandiose narcissist, whose controlling and demanding nature can imbue their life with constant direction and purpose, whether or not that is any good for them. Try as they might to borrow a sense of self from others, nothing quite fits, and they're left feeling empty and unsatisfied. Mirroring cannot last forever, as it is a tiring facade and the disorder must surface eventually. Following the idealization phase, the grandiose narcissist is slowly confronted with the normal and flawed person they've associated with, which creates a feeling of dissonance when held next to their idealized mental representation. From this, they rationalize that the person must have deceived them in some way, and feel an underlying resentment and rage. According to the emotional logic of the narcissist, any negative perception of someone must mean they are all bad, so they will begin a process known as devaluation, where they will begin making many undermining and critical comments, attempting to punish and coerce the other person into matching with the desired form in their idealized image. Some victims get stuck here, trying desperately to appease the narcissist, until they break down from being held to impossible, disordered expectations. The narcissist also begins to resent the other for needing them even though they are weak, and for the fact that the relationship regularly confronts them with their own weaknesses and failures, their inability to form a healthy emotional connection, or avoid abusing their partner. Since the narcissist cannot introspect about any of this, their mind will manufacture whatever it must to tar the other person as the problem, going as far as to make believe events, or project non-existent malevolent motives onto others. They attack in others what they hate in themselves. They demean others as if to say, "I don't need anyone." A thing that victims need to internalize is that nothing you do in this process really matters. So long as they have you in their grip, you cannot fix them, cannot save them, cannot change their reactions in any way that matters. This is because, as much as they tell you otherwise, you're not responsible for their actions. Their disorder is. Many of us feel a keen sense of injustice when we are unfairly characterized, and in this, we can get caught up trying to reason for our self-image with the narcissist. What we don't realize is that this gives them a great amount of power over our well-being. When we can accept that their feedback is unreliable, a reflection not of who we are, but of their inner misery projected outwards, we can safely ignore it. The tactics of the narcissist are like fish hooks, designed to snare in people who feel invalid. They seek out people who are trying to heal their inner wounds by giving to others. Both the narcissist and the wounded souls they ensnare need to take a hard look at themselves, because neither benefits from their pairing. It only delays recovery by giving each a scapegoat in the other. A person to enable their worst tendencies, a person to blame for why they're stuck in life. You will not get their acknowledgement of the reality of things between you. You will not get a meaningful apology. They will use your love and empathy and sense of obligation to trap you in a loop of constantly trying to appease them so they can use you to regulate themselves. They're not capable of real human interaction. The person you thought you knew was never real. It was a construct to keep you nearby to regulate them. A key element of this type of abuse is the way they somehow make their victims feel responsible for how they acted, responsible for their abuse. If the victim does not find their way out, they will likely be tortured until they deny or hate themselves, similar to the narcissist, or they end up discarded. The devaluation phase of the vulnerable narcissist is somewhat different. When a vulnerable narcissist senses that they are losing control on a supply, and may not be able to use a relationship for self-regulation anymore, they enter a state where they snap shut emotionally, and treat the other partner with a cold, fearful distance. They are extremely emotionally dysregulated, but may try to put on a facade of cool ambivalence. They may even show contempt for their partner, or manipulate or emotionally abuse them. This phase is called relationship testing. This condition remains until they are reassured that the other person will stay and regulate them, no matter what. The core of this is their crippling fear of abandonment. Oddly enough, the neurotic behavior created by this fear of abandonment, ostensibly to protect them, tends to be the actual cause for the end of their relationships. If the victim is beginning to see through their behavior, or criticize them, and stand up to them, their psychology, with its extreme emotions and black and white thinking, cannot perceive the nuance in it, and instead believes they are being accused of being all bad, similar to how they see themselves due to their core wound. This triggers the core wound, making them feel vulnerable and exposed, causing a very painful dissonance in them, and with their trouble identifying the source of their discontent. In their own disordered psychology, they will blame the people around them for this internal experience. The presence of the other is confronting them with their flaw, and they cannot be known for their true wounded self, so the other will have to go. Now they will unconsciously begin to create the justifications for leaving. Here they will escalate their behavior, becoming increasingly distant, irrational and abusive, provoking their partner to show some imagined, hidden abusive self. This abuse can get so bad that victims, bewildered and under attack, can't help but escalate their criticism or strike back, only confirming the all bad image that the narcissist is trying to create to justify leaving. They will cling to minor flaws or moments as horrific victimizations against themselves, for which no apology or acknowledgement will be enough, with seemingly no self-awareness of the abuse they've been committing to get here. Once they have successfully demonized the partner and utterly sabotaged anything good left in the relationship, they can now safely discard them. Unfortunately, nothing the victim does or says during this stage can make an impact, since the deficiency lies not in their actions, but in the narcissist's warped perception. Nothing besides giving up your own personhood to become their mindless validation machine would be good enough. This abandonment can also be symbolic of abandoning the parent who never met their needs. This phenomenon is known as transference, where roles and emotions from past events are overlaid on unrelated people and events for unconscious catharsis. In the fantasy world, the victim is playing the role of the evil parent who's about to get rejected and owned, epic style. In reality, the victim, who probably just pointed out some concerning behavior and asked for basic respect, is being made to feel like the worst person in the world for it, for no reason. Discarding the partner this way provides a brief emotional catharsis for the narcissist, who has symbolically abandoned the abusive parent in their mind, but leaves victims utterly destroyed and confused. The discard of the vulnerable narcissist can be somewhat different. Here they might bombard the partner with accusations of being the abuser, projecting all their own self-hated qualities onto them, and then abandoning them. They do this so they don't have to feel the sting of rejection, so they can abandon the other person before they are abandoned, avoiding a worse hit to their core wound. Because of the narcissist's pathological need for validation or care, and avoidance of introspection, they will often connect with a new or old source of supply before discarding their current person. That way they can just swing from one relationship to the next, avoiding reflection or pain. This is known as monkey branching. Now safely in the new relationship, they will forget all their abusive episodes that they dissociated through, retreating into a simple, emotional, fantastical recollection of events where they were the misunderstood victim, who one day discovered that the one they gave their heart to was secretly a monster who betrayed them and never really cared about them. They will tell a warped self-victimizing account of this story to others, to fish for validation, reinforce their delusion, and preemptively spread the word first, to insulate themselves from further criticism or abandonment. The new supply will be put through the same devastating cycle of abuse, so there's no need to feel like you're missing out. For a vulnerable narcissist, their perception is shaped by their emotions and convenience. If you turn the other person bad in your mind, then it isn't your fault that you sabotaged the relationship, abused them, split on them, and abandoned them. It was almost just like a terrible fact of life that happened to you, that it'd be easier to forget. For them, this ritual can feel like substitutively leaving the abusive parent who wounded them. This catharsis quickly fades for the narcissist, however, who has not actually relieved their suffering condition, and they may come back to repeat this ritual again if their partner is naive and desperate enough to expect different this time. This is called a hoover. Usually the narcissist checks in when they've burned bridges with the others in their life and need supply again. They're checking in to see if you've gotten over your little temper tantrum of wanting love and respect, to see if you'll put up with their abuse again. Just as they've forgotten or reframed all their abuse, they've also forgotten how much contempt they had for you towards the end. They might feign some great epiphany and promise to do better, but the cycle will just begin again, with you being idealized and devalued until you are discarded. Each time is more painful than the last. You cannot have a real relationship with someone like this, and it's best to move on. This harmful dance shows the utter irrational self-destruction that untreated narcissists are capable of. Regardless, developing any kind of close personal relationship with a narcissist will reveal their true dysfunction, as needing to share any kind of vulnerability, intimacy, or connection with you will continuously confront them with their inability to form a meaningful connection with anyone, highlighting their flaw and triggering their core wound, which only escalates their behavior. Your purpose in being around them is to serve as supply, not to confront them with any inconvenient truths. This ritual might also be seen as the logical conclusion of getting close to a highly disordered person, where they eventually treat their partner with the raw, unbridled contempt and dysregulation they usually reserve for themselves. As it was with my parents, grandiose and vulnerable narcissists often end up together, as the grandiose person's constant regime of demands and criticisms can give the vulnerable one a warped sense of purpose, and can, in a warped type of comfort, confirm their eternal psychological suspicion of being undervalued and unappreciated. Again, the stages are love bombing, idealization, devaluation, discard. Understanding and describing this process is relatively easy, nothing like living it directly. To be utterly neglected in your human emotional needs, to be both worshipped and hated randomly, to live in hypervigilance for their next outburst, to take on the burdens of their unmanaged mental illness, to be gaslit until you can't feel the ground beneath your feet, to feel it blame for everything, to feel utterly disposable. The pain, confusion, and grief are indescribable, especially for children who have no choice raised in this invisible chaos. I will be honest in saying that I am not yet equipped to compassionately walk you through the steps of slowly unmeshing yourself from a narcissist in your life. From my point of view, it is as simple as slowly divesting your thoughts and feelings from this person, no longer allowing them to affect the decisions you make for the betterment of your life, and placing and enforcing boundaries regardless of their objections. But I also know it's not that simple. The truth is, I still suffer some narcissism. Even now, some part of me has contempt for those who are so weak they would allow themselves to be thrown around like utter trash. When I search for what is underneath that thought, it is a deep sadness for how helpless I feel about being able to make an impact at all. I think all narcissists could benefit from looking for the truth behind their defense mechanisms. Narcissists can struggle with memory surrounding their outbursts, often dissociating when their core wound is triggered, or when they act out in ways that contradict their mask of flawlessness. They have an emotional memory, recalling events more by how they felt than what actually happened. They will often frame the events later by their own perceived victimhood or comeuppances. Vulnerable narcissists tend to like social media and online relationships, where they can selectively filter themselves and control how others perceive them. They might filter the reality of their dysregulated emotions and abusive episodes from their posts. They might try to validate or normalize highly dysfunctional thoughts and behavior to a community of similar-minded people. They might construct an image as a cute, harmless fairy bunny, who can do no wrong. They might run a meme page as a self-aware jokester, where the joke is just a plain articulation of their dysfunctional thinking overlaid on a picture of a sad anime girl. They might play the misunderstood martyr, becoming a champion against the stigma of their condition, speaking blithely over the experiences of survivors. A self-constructed ideal self can obscure flaws to themselves or others, and make a dent in their core wound, at least for a while. You might also find that they have an overt appreciation for animals over humans, as animals can be an endless source of affirmation that cannot criticize or abandon them. Or, in the case of more cruel antisocial narcissists, they might abuse animals for the fact that they can't tell anyone or escape. Narcissists are avoidant of any introspection or accountability, because to gain any insight or self-awareness would be quite painful for someone like that. So there's a mental block there, and they've developed a number of unconscious survival mechanisms to protect them from self-awareness. They lie to themselves and others about their disordered inner world. They will defend themselves from even the most moderate criticism as if it were an attack against them. They will deny, deflect, rationalize, justify, blame, and believe whatever helps them tune out of dissonance about themselves and regulate again. Another form of invalidation that narcissists often practice is DARVO, or deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. When confronted with their abuse, they first deny it, then they attack you, making you emotional and on edge, then they play the victim and frame you as the true abuser. They feel a lot of pain in being confronted with themselves, interpreting it as a malicious attack. That's why they strike with blind vitriol. They feel entitled not to have to look inwards, and so feel victimized by being asked to. These emotions form their reality, which is then rationalized through whatever excuses they can come up with to tar the victim as the real problem. This can be deeply confusing and hurtful for victims, who simply want their reality acknowledged. Victims of this technique may question their sanity or memory in a form of gaslighting. Narcissists survive by transferring their shame onto others. They project their most hated qualities onto you and attack you as a proxy for themselves. Their constant abuse always keeps you on the back foot, and their constant lying can make you doubt your own perception of reality. Agreeable people, looking to make sense of the impossible or disarm the chaos, are at risk to be convinced they are the disordered one. This is likely a mirror of what their own narcissistic abuser did to them. It's almost like they are trying to give their disorder away. A narcissist is naturally threatened by the possibility of solidarity between their various victims. Victims must be isolated with the abuser's logic for it to work. To this end, a narcissist will try to alienate victims by pitting them against each other. Sarah said you were looking fat today. And of course, they are also telling Sarah nasty things you supposedly said too. These can be lies or exaggerations reflecting the narcissist's opinions. This is known as triangulation. The intention is to drive a wedge between people who might otherwise be able to collectively identify their abuse. The trick with this is to deal directly with other people instead of relying on the narcissist as an intermediary. Any truth in what was said will be distorted when filtered through their agenda. A common form of triangulation is the golden child and the scapegoat, where one victim is upheld as the ideal, or shielded from abuse, while the other is blanketed in shame. The scapegoat serves as a human target for all the unaddressed shame and dysfunction of the household. Their purpose is to take on the burden of this shame passively, so a reckoning with reality can be delayed. The golden child is the one who survives this madness by appeasing and regulating the narcissist through this drama. The cost of protection is allegiance. Both victims will be too alienated from each other to figure out the puzzle of what's happening, leaving them both isolated in the abuser's regime. In absence of any ability to form a reciprocal relationship, these tactics are what is developed to keep anyone around. To escape this abuse, you must stop putting any stock in the opinion, acknowledgement, or validation of the abuser, and practice radical acceptance that this is just how they are. You cannot change them alone. You are never going to have a normal relationship with this person, and you have always been worthy of patience and love. For empathetic people, apologies are an expression of the fact that we can feel the pain of others as our own, that we feel socially obligated to them. We regret how hurtful or unfair we had been. We grapple with the pain we caused, because we can imagine it happening to us. For narcissists, an apology can feel wholly unnecessary, except as a social utility to manipulate others into believing you care, or into backing off from a confrontation. It's also an act of vulnerability, which is something narcissists hate and avoid. This is why, if you can ever get an apology out of a narcissist, they act as if they've been victimized by having to apologize to you, that it should magically serve the function of relieving all your grief and pain, and should end the dispute over their abuse entirely. They have no internal regulating mechanism to actually understand the purpose of apologies and accountability. When going low or no contact with a narcissist, you will quickly become aware of a phenomenon known as flying monkeys. This is another triangulation tactic. This term describes family or friends whom the narcissist is able to trick and manipulate into sympathizing with them, and into reaching out to you on their behalf, usually to spout a bunch of contextless, guilt-tripping, gaslighting nonsense, pleading with you to return or forgive and appease the abuser. They might also try to gather information about you, or tease and hurt you, as a form of revenge by proxy. A flying monkey is likely a codependent enabler. This happens for many reasons. For a long time, they have been told distorted, one-sided stories about you by the narcissist, and have no idea what has actually been happening. The abuser might show them a different side than they show you. If they like being around an abuser, they might have their own unaddressed abusive tendencies too. When you left, the narcissist needed a new supply or scapegoat, and became extremely dysregulated, lashing out at those around them, or chatting the ear off of anyone who would listen, and some just want you to return to your old role so they can have their peace back. Often the codependent's role is to maintain peace by appeasing the abuser. It's also very confronting to see another person call out or leave a shared abuser. It makes you question if you should be doing that too. Frustration is then misdirected at the person leaving for making them feel uncomfortable. It's easier to blame you than to face their own victimization. You can't make anyone see the monster in their midst if they're invested in never seeing it. Every adult has to wake up by their own effort and time. Don't destroy yourself trying to save other victims. You're better off healing yourself and sharing your honest commentary with those still in the abuser's grip. Narcissists are not often aware that their thinking is disordered. The term for this is egosyntonic. To them, disorder is all they've ever known, like water to the fish. This doesn't mean they're unaware of how unacceptable their behavior is. This can be seen most clearly when they act normal or saintly in front of others, later unloading on victims in private. They imagine everyone else is as uncaring and self-centered as them. It's part of how they rationalize their behavior. They may even rationalize that this behavior protects them. And it does. In the short term. It protects them from having to be present, vulnerable and honest with themselves about the pain of what they went through. Protects them from being affected by the pain of others. But long term, it will destroy their ability to maintain relationships and potentially ruin many lives. I have a theory that my contempt for weakness originated in the way I was raised, in a household ruled over by the petulant emotional demands of a vulnerable narcissist. They made me live in isolation for their anxiety. They shamed me for every ounce of my independence from them, terrorizing me into giving up my identity. Trying to reason with them was impossible. Emotional outbursts were weapons, to be deployed to shape the world to their demands. They lied constantly and could never take responsibility for anything. They played victim every time they were caught out on something. From this, I learned a stupid lesson, that emotions are a tool of weak, stupid people to get what they want. And so I worked to suppress mine, eventually rationalizing the world as a means of survival. I developed a sense of superiority about it, believing I was better than other people, because I was not weak. The reality under the surface was that I was an incredibly emotional person, and because I wasn't dealing with my emotions, I never learned how to regulate them. It took an embarrassingly long time for me to realize that this was a misguided survival mechanism, not a life philosophy, or a suit of armor. I suppose another reason to emotionally disconnect is because, to be feeling what you are supposed to be feeling would be unlivable. That is the emotional world of the narcissist. To live as a narcissist can be quite painful. The vitriol they direct at others is a representation of how they treat themselves internally every day. Their attempts to regulate themselves show just how dysregulated they are inside. Try as they might to fix themselves with this maladaptive behavior, it is never enough, and can't fix the damage long term, leaving them feeling empty and unsatisfied inside, followed by a trail of wrecked relationships that make their lives harder. The longer this goes on unchecked, the more they damage themselves, and everyone around them, making the stakes higher and higher in recognizing their responsibility and need for help. If you know someone like this, some distanced advice and compassion can make an impact. Know, however, some people like this cannot be helped, and they will spend the rest of their lives making everyone miserable, all while somehow blaming everyone else. Because I lived an emotionally detached life, I couldn't see the beauty right in front of me. The world appeared dull, ugly, and gray to me. I wouldn't even describe who I was then, as alive. I was a bundle of survival mechanisms that randomly inflicted pain on people. I spent my youth demeaning the perfectly healthy emotions in those around me. I derided people as weak for being human. I rejected the exact thing I needed, because it hurt to be vulnerable, and I blamed them. The reality is, I am the weak one. I wasted my entire youth, and 9 years more, living what could barely be called a life, trying desperately to fix my narcissistic parents, and by proxy, trying to fill the memory of my emotionally bereft childhood. I wish so badly that I had been able to see the exit door earlier, that literally anybody would have helped me see my worth, and to get out. Some tried. My behavior ended up pushing so many decent people away. This is why this video exists, to help you see that exit door, so you can save yourself before it's too late. I see your compassion. I see your goodness. I see you trying. Somehow that has to be enough. Please, do not make the same mistake your mother did. In lifeguarding class, we learned that, to approach a drowning person, you should use your leg to keep them at a distance, or dive to surprise them, and put them in a hold to minimize their flailing. In extreme cases, you must knock them out to save them. Saving a narcissist requires specialized knowledge and tools that most of us don't have. You didn't fail to help them. Our society failed to prevent their condition, failed to organize a coherent response, and failed to protect you from their abuse. They may have made you feel like their savior, but you're not responsible for them. You are allowed to be happy. Some will take issue that I have described narcissism as having many of the symptoms more associated with other cluster B disorders. For example, I have included the unstable sense of self and fear of abandonment usually associated with BPD. This is partially because these are just a bunch of momentary categories we use to try to conceptualize the actual complexity we're gesturing at. What is the core of cluster B? I think it is more useful to think of cluster B as oriented around the shared core wound, with various manifestations, depending on other elements of emotionality or personality. This is what I call narcissism, because it fits with all my experiences and studies. I suspect that, more or less, a person with borderline is a vulnerable narcissist. And I think that such people would rather you focus on their internal struggles and suffering to distract from the pointless hell they regularly inflict on people who care about them. Even in this, their self-focus and their avoidancy of sitting with their core wound shines through. I also think current distinctions are not well enough established, and I suspect that narcissism is far more common than the diagnosed disorder. When I look at the online content sphere regarding narcissistic abuse, I find the focus tends to be on encouraging victims to personally minimize or cut contact. It makes sense. Personally distancing yourself from abuse can make a large impact. It's just that there is rarely a deeper analysis present. Rarely anything said for what we can do to make an impact on the presence of such mental dysfunction in our societies, never mind acknowledging its origin. We're simply not going to be able to leave every narcissist at once. There will always be another victim to get snared in their web. Our society protects, encourages, and enables much of their behavior. Short of having a society that forces narcissists into treatment, what eventually developed my self-awareness was having hundreds of encounters where people explained how I made them feel and shared their observations about my behavior, followed by placing boundaries or distancing themselves from me. There are no words for the regret I feel in having treated people this way, or for how thankful I am that they made that effort to explain before they left. I am thankful now in retrospect, but at the time I definitely dismissed and attacked those people as a defense mechanism. Eventually, isolated and alone, I felt I had no choice but to seek an understanding outside myself. At the time I suffered greatly and was often suicidal. It is not any one person's fault or responsibility that anyone has this disorder, that they suffer internally. It's like how some people get cancer or die randomly. It is the uncaring chaos of the universe. In an ideal world, we would facilitate the most effective treatment. Until then, our best defense is to get people on the same page about what we're dealing with. We used to be a relatively peaceful egalitarian tribal species, whose survival depended on social cohesion, depended on living in balance with nature. Now there's a problem of scale. None of us could possibly get to know the thousands around us personally. Furthermore, in the age of technology, With mass media and the internet, our understanding of social reality is mediated through and replaced by unaccountable private entities, algorithms driven by controversy, novelty, and corporate propaganda. Politics is abstracted and deeply corrupt, and we all know it. In the name of profit and luxury, we allow our industrialists to break the delicate balance of nature. Every day we are pitted against each other, in competition for jobs and resources, and perhaps one day in brutal war. Of course we keep to ourselves. This societal organization is an amoral antisocial mess, and it is not only killing us, it is shaping us into emotionally battered, self-centered people. The tendency to reduce issues of mental health to what individuals can do is endemic to all of liberal psychology. Since these institutions are largely funded by the current order, an unspoken assumption in most fields is that capitalist society is largely a natural compromise with reality and just how things are, so they don't engage with the possibility that there might be a deeper solution than personally leaving abusers. Ignorant liberal professionals try to understand disorders like these through their most extreme presentations, as rare objective conditions a person might have, largely separate from any systemic analysis, conceived of mainly for clinical navel-gazing, founding a useless diagnosis most narcissists would never show up to get, yet insisting they get to gatekeep what is and isn't narcissism. Psychology is meant for everyday people, to help us understand our place in the world. It is meant to make the world a better place. It is supposed to examine and explain how conditions like these actually work, and how they are a necessary and condemning product of our corrupt and inadequate societal order. Consider the narcissism inherent to empire and colonialism. Imagine the abuse required to convince a child to adjust to the injustice around them in a colonial regime. Think of the generational trauma passed down by those who either participated in or turned their eyes from the brutal violence. Think of the modern beneficiaries of such violence, who turn from their history like a narcissist turns from their core wound. Consider the narcissism of someone who won't stand to hear political and social issues explored, unless it orients around their comfort and privilege. Ponder narcissism as an attitude fostered in working people by the incentives of the current order. To be apathetic and turn your eyes from injustice, to market yourself as valuable to survive, to rationalize poverty in a wealthy world. Narcissism is fostered in our youth by unchecked social media, influencer, and celebrity culture. Narcissism is the lifeblood of a capitalist society. It is not a thing people have sometimes. It is the rational result of a broken societal organization where detached self-interest means survival. It is a condition that arises when we make humans live in inhuman conditions. It's what happens when we put our lives in the hands of a bunch of social climbing narcissists, who we passively allow to rig things in their benefit. That the rich now feel like they can exploit the working and renting masses, based on social contract, while hiding in their fancy mansions, shows how baked into the structure of our society that narcissism is. Institutional psychology is part of the neoliberal religion that keeps the poor from murdering the rich. Such an institution has no authority or mandate on truth. Listen primarily to the voices of radicals who study these things, not institutions. Thank you for listening, and for sharing this intimate time with me. Reflecting on these things, my mind went to some really dark places. It is easier when you are here with me. Seeing you here now, your soul shining next to mine, I feel lucky to be able to glimpse your beauty, even if only for a moment. Each time I reflect on my experiences, new horrors become clear to me, and the gaslighting voices of my abusers flood back in to make me doubt myself again. I don't like thinking back, because I feel such a regret and guilt for who I was, the completely pointless pain I caused others, my wasted youth. Sometimes, it makes me want to die. I want you to know that our time together means a lot to me. My audience is small. I read every comment. I know all your names. It is such a privilege to have you here. It's hard to believe it's been 3 years. What started as an attempt to make my death mean something has saved me by giving me a medium to deconstruct my very being and rebuild myself after trauma. You've watched as I self-actualized through creation. You've watched me tear down layer after layer of my detachment and ego. You've watched me grow a greater sense of empathy and compassion. You've stayed as I revealed stigmatizing things about myself. And you've tolerated or enjoyed my perverted antics. Thank you. I don't know why you're still here. I can only hope that I've been able to help you heal as well. Do you want to go pee-pee? Let's go pee-pee with mommy in the shower.